Imagine an entirely legal protest, like totally legal, that brings one of the world's busiest airports to just a complete grinding halt.
Right. Not with picket signs or anything.
No, exactly. Not with barricades, not with people gluing their hands to the tarmac, just thousands of people simply paying a dime to use a public restroom.
A perfectly orchestrated deployment of, well, bladder-based corfare.
Exactly. I mean, passengers are getting off these long international flights. They are desperate for a bathroom, and every single stall is legally occupied by someone just, reading a newspaper.
And the entire travel hub freezes.
Yeah. Nobody broke a single law. The police are completely powerless to intervene.
It's the establishment's worst nightmare, really. Drawn up by a man who treated community organizing less like a, lofty moral crusade and much more like a gritty, uncompromising science.
Which brings us to today's deep dive. Welcome in. Today we are unpacking a stack of excerpts from a 1971 text that is, well, it remains equal parts highly influential and deeply controversial.
Saul Alinsky's Rules for Radicals.
Yes. And we should probably pause right at the top here, because the tactics we are pulling from this source material today, they are incredibly provocative.
Highly provocative, yeah.
So some people read these sources as this brilliant blueprint for street justice for the marginalized, right? And others read them as a literal manual for cynical, amoral manipulation.
It is intensely polarizing.
It really is. So for this deep dive, we are purely looking under the hood. We are absolutely not here to endorse who should be driving the car or which political direction it should go. We're not taking sides.
Right. Our mission is just to impartially unpack the original source material so you can understand how the actual engine of mass power organization works.
Exactly, because Alinsky was a veteran community organizer in Chicago, right?
He was, yeah. And he wrote this text as a pragmatic primer for what he called the have-nots.
Right, the have.
Everyday people without money, without traditional authority, who basically wanted to systematically take power away from the haves.
And to build that kind of power, Alinsky says you have to start with this brutal acceptance of reality. He calls it the tension between the world as it is versus the world as we would like it to be.
Yes, that distinction is foundational to his whole philosophy.
Okay, let's unpack this, because it's a fascinating concept. It's kind of like trying to navigate a really complex, maybe dangerous city, right? If you use a map of how you wish the streets were laid out, like where traffic is always light and everything is totally fair, you are going to crash.
You're going to crash immediately.
Yeah.
And the interesting psychological question that he raises is why so many organizers refuse to put down that fake map.
Oh, right. Why cling to the fantasy?
Exactly. And Alinsky argues that clinging to the fantasy of how the world should be, it actually protects your ego.
Oh, wow. How so?
Well, think about it. If you take the absolute moral high ground and you completely refuse to compromise, and then you fail to achieve your goals, you get to just blame the corrupt system.
Oh, I see. You get to remain pure.
Right. You remain pure. You didn't fail. The world just wasn't good enough for your righteous ideas.
But if you actually get down into the mud and you fight according to the actual gritty rules of power politics, and then you fail.
Then you only have yourself to blame.
Wow. Yeah, that strips away all your excuses, doesn't it?
It does. Which brings us to this sharp distinction he makes between what he calls the rhetorical radical and the realistic radical.
And he had zero patience for the rhetorical kind.
None at all. I mean, the rhetorical radical is the person out there just shouting tired slogans, sticking to strict dogma, and essentially alienating the very people they are trying to reach.
Like they might deliberately insult local traditions or pick fights with the cops just to prove how uncompromising they are.
Exactly. It feels much more like a performance of personal purity, rather than a strategy to actually win over a community.
Right. He gave that example, what was it, the Orthodox Jewish community.
Oh, yeah. He argued that if you are trying to organize an Orthodox Jewish community, you don't walk into a meeting eating a ham sandwich just to assert your independence.
Right, because doing that just means you're looking for an excuse to get rejected.
Precisely. You want to get rejected so you can cop out of the grueling work of actual organizing.
So the realistic radical, by contrast, they adapt to the audience.
Completely. If having long hair creates this psychological barrier to communicating with, say, a specific working class community, the realistic radical simply cuts their hair.
Because the ultimate goal is connection, not self-expression.
Connection is the absolute prerequisite for change. I mean, Alinsky leaned heavily on Dostoevsky's observation here.
The one about fear.
Yeah, that taking a new step or uttering a new word is what people fear most. You can't just demand instant dramatic revolution from people who are fundamentally terrified of the unknown.
Right, you have to guide them. Reformation has to come before revolution.
You work inside the system. You agitate people just enough to make them disillusioned with the status quo, but you build a psychological bridge for them to cross.
From their own familiar experience to a new way of thinking.
Right, because pushing too hard, like terrifying the masses, it backfires spectacularly.
They just sprint in the opposite direction.
Exactly. They run toward the far right, demanding severe law and order just to feel safe again.
Okay, so this is where we hit a massive philosophical wall. Because once you accept this gritty world as it is, right, you cut your hair to communicate, you prepare to fight in the mud, how do you decide what actions are ethically acceptable to get what you want?
Yes. The eternal question. Does the end justify the means?
Right. And Alinsky calls that a completely meaningless question.
He does. He argues the real question is always, does this particular end justify this particular means?
It's just absolute pragmatism.
It is. He viewed ethics through this lens of pure relativity. To him, believing that corrupt means automatically corrupt, the ends is like, I think he said, it's like believing in the immaculate conception of principles.
That is quite a phrase.
Yeah. He lays out these specific rules of ethical relativity. And one of the main ones is that a person's concern with ethics generally decreases the closer they are to a conflict.
Oh, that makes total sense. I mean, it is incredibly easy to be highly moral about a conflict happening on the other side of the globe.
Right. Sitting in your armchair.
Exactly. But when your own survival or your community's survival is immediately on the line, your ethical standards become remarkably flexible.
And Alinsky points out a crucial dynamic here about the establishment, the haves. They already operate under the rule that the ends justify the means to maintain their power.
Oh, sure.
But they demand that the have-nots play by these strict, polite moral rules entirely as a way to keep marginalized groups docile.
So the game is rigged from the start. And the sources prove this by pulling from American history, actually. The Revolutionary War.
The Sam Adams example.
Yes. Sam Adams, beloved American patriot, basically manipulated the narrative of the Boston Massacre.
Latently manipulated it.
Yeah.
So, a victim of the massacre, Patrick Carr, he actually gave a deathbed confession.
Right.
And in it, he stated that the townspeople had actually been the aggressors and the British soldiers had fired purely in self-defense.
Which is wild because that confession would have completely destroyed the patriot narrative, right? This idea of innocent Americans being slaughtered by tyrannical redcoats.
Completely destroyed it. But Sam Adams didn't hesitate. He went on the offensive and discredited Carr's testimony.
How did he do it?
By pointing out to the public that Carr was an Irish papist who likely died in the confession of the Catholic Church.
Wow, so he just weaponized blatant religious bigotry to protect the narrative of the revolution.
Exactly. To the British, this was an immoral, disgusting tactic. But to the American patriots, it was a brilliant strategy to keep the revolution alive.
Because history is written by the winners.
Always. And the winners usually get to decide retroactively what was ethical.
Okay, but I have to push back on this.
Go for it.
If everything is relative, right, and your ethics just change depending on whether you are winning or losing, does the organizer have any true moral compass at all? I mean, it sounds like a blank check to justify literally any terrible action as long as it gets results.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Alinsky would counter that the free society organizer is anchored to high values.
Like what?
Values like freedom, equality, justice, the preciousness of human life. The core issue, in his view, is the people he refers to as the means and ends moralists.
The do-nothings.
Exactly. The people who sit on the sidelines of history.
Just judging everyone else.
Right. They preserve their own personal moral purity by completely refusing to engage in the messy, compromising reality of conflict.
They sit back with clean hands while oppression actually triumphs.
Yes. And to Alinsky, choosing to do nothing because you are afraid of soiling your hands is the absolute nadir of immorality.
So the most unethical means of all is the non-use of any means.
Exactly. Inaction is the ultimate sin.
Wow. Okay, so that brings us to the actual battlefield. You have a group of have-nots. They have no money, they have no institutional leverage, but they do have bodies. They have people. How do you deploy people against an establishment that holds all the traditional power?
Well, you rely heavily on perception and psychology. One of his foundational tactical rules is that power is not just what you have, but what the enemy thinks you have.
Right. So if your organization is actually pretty small, you conceal your numbers but make a massive amount of noise.
You let the enemy's own anxiety multiply your forces in their mind.
That's smart.
It is.
Yeah.
Another critical rule is to never go outside the experience of your people.
Because if you ask your community to execute a tactic they don't understand or they feel uncomfortable with, it just breeds confusion.
Confusion and inevitable retreat. They'll just give up. But conversely, whenever possible, you must go outside the experience of the enemy.
Right. You hit them with scenarios they have absolutely no standard operating procedure for.
You cause panic because they cannot rely on their usual methods of control.
And what I found so fascinating in the sources is that the emotional state of your people matters immensely during all of this.
Oh, it's everything.
Alinsky insists that a good tactic is one your people actually enjoy. Like, if it is a dreary, miserable chore, the tactic is fundamentally flawed.
That idea of enjoyment is exactly why Alinsky weaponized ridicule. He literally calls ridicule man's most potent weapon.
And I imagine it's so potent because it completely strips the establishment of their dignity.
Exactly. I mean, you can deploy riot police against a traditional protest, but how do you arrest a crowd for laughing at you?
You can't.
You really can't. Ridicule is almost impossible to counterattack. If someone presents a logical argument, you can debate it. If they use physical force, you can meet it with superior force.
But open mockery.
It just infuriates the opposition. It drives them to make irrational, angry mistakes that the organizer can then exploit.
Okay, to truly grasp how all these rules synergize, right? Going outside the enemy's experience, weaponizing ridicule, making it enjoyable for your people, we have to look at the Rochester Symphony tactic.
Oh, this is a quintessential Alinsky maneuver.
It's wild. So his organization in Rochester, New York, they were called FSH. They were locked in this bitter battle with the Eastman Kodak establishment over local hiring practices.
Right. And Alinsky needed to hit the city's wealthy elite where they felt most secure.
So he targeted the local symphony concert, which is, the crown jewel of the establishment's social season.
A highly refined, very quiet, culturally revered event.
Right. So he suggested the organization buy 100 tickets for community members. And the tactical genius was the pre-concert meal.
The baked beans.
Yes. A massive 3-hour dinner consisting entirely of baked beans.
Huge quantities of them.
The plan was simply to send those 100 ticket holders to the quiet concert hall and just, let natural physical functions take their course.
I mean, think about this analytically. It breaks no laws. You literally cannot be arrested for flatulence.
Right. The police are useless. The ushers are useless.
Right. It is completely outside the experience of the wealthy patrons. They have no script for how to handle it. It employs devastating ridicule, and the community members executing the tactic would be having the absolute time of their lives.
It is completely absurd, but it perfectly fits every single one of his rules.
It does.
And he designed a similar tactic involving watermelons, didn't he?
He did. This was a plan to have Black community members simultaneously descend on the downtown shopping area of an exclusive lily-white suburb.
Right.
And they would all be carrying and eating massive slices of watermelon.
Wow.
It was designed to explicitly mock and ridicule the racist stereotypes held by the white residents.
Because it forces the absurdity of their own prejudice right into their faces.
Exactly. It deeply unnerves the establishment because it's profoundly outside their experience. And again, you can't arrest someone for eating fruit.
But here's where it gets really interesting. In both the O'Hare Airport example we opened with and the Rochester Symphony scenario, the tactics didn't even have to be fully executed.
No, they didn't. Because the threat is usually more terrifying than the thing itself. That is a core Alinsky principle.
Right. The mere leak of the baked bean plan or the whisper that the airport toilets might be occupied, that alone was enough to force the establishment to the negotiating table.
Because an action has a defined beginning and end, right? The establishment can calculate the PR damage of a protest.
They know how to handle a protest.
Exactly. But a threat engages the establishment's own anxiety. Their imagination conjures up these worst-case scenarios, causing them to panic and just concede before a single baked bean is ever eaten.
And he called this mass jujitsu, right?
Yeah, mass jujitsu, using the massive weight and rigidity of the establishment against itself.
So these grassroots, street-level tactics were incredibly effective for marginalized groups fighting these local battles. But Alinsky realized something crucial as he went on.
He did.
To achieve true systemic mass power in America, the focus eventually had to shift.
He recognized that even if all the poor and minority groups united, they simply lacked the sheer numbers and structural power to force basic systemic changes without allies.
They needed the demographic holding the most leverage in society.
The middle class.
The group he famously categorized as the have a little want mores.
Right, because they are politically torn. They desperately want change so they can get more out of life, but they are terrified of losing the little security they have already managed to accumulate.
And the challenge is, you can't really radicalize the middle class using baked beans and airport bathrooms.
No, definitely not. They have a deep aversion to rudeness and overt conflict, and they generally feel numb, bewildered, and kind of helpless in this massive corporate economy.
So you have to find a tactic that fits their experience.
Exactly. You need a legally sound, totally respectable mechanism that still allows them to wield devastating power.
Which led Alinsky to the proxy tactic.
Yes, the proxy tactic.
And for anyone whose 401k paperwork usually just goes straight to the recycling bin, we should probably explain what a proxy actually is.
Good idea.
A stock proxy is basically your legal right as a shareholder to vote on corporate decisions.
And in the 1970s, as is largely true today, the middle class held vast amounts of power in the form of these proxies.
Through their investments.
Right. Their investments, mutual funds, university endowments, churches, pension plans.
So it's kind of like realizing that the most effective way to conquer a castle isn't to stand outside the moat throwing rocks at the walls. It's to use the castle's own property deeds to legally vote the king off the throne.
That's a great analogy, because usually people just throw those proxy voting cards in the trash, or they blindly sign them over to corporate management.
But Alinsky envisioned mobilizing the middle class to gather those proxies, to show up at corporate shareholder meetings with millions of proxy votes and literally challenge corporate policies from the inside out.
Whether it was challenging a corporation on its pollution record, discriminatory hiring practices, or exploitative foreign operations.
And remember the era. This is pre-internet. Gathering these physical proxy cards from across the country was an absolute organizational nightmare.
Oh, a total nightmare. But this raises an important question. Why do it?
Right.
The psychological shift it offered the middle class was profound. It gave the numb, apathetic citizen a real sword to swing.
It didn't violate their middle-class norms of respectability, but it was highly disruptive to the corporate establishment.
You are literally using the machinery of capitalism to force social change.
And Alinsky saw this as the great revolution of the future, didn't he?
He did. He believed that organizing the middle class around proxies would awaken them from their civic sleep. It would cure their anonymity.
It transforms a plight into a problem.
Exactly.
Because as long as people feel powerless, they just accept a bad situation as their plight, like the weather. You can't change the weather.
Right.
But the moment you give them a tangible tool, like a proxy vote, that plight becomes a problem they can actively solve.
And once they realized they actually owned the companies they felt oppressed by, and they could force a major corporation to change its behavior.
They would carry that empowered momentum into local elections, national politics, and beyond.
That framework is exactly why Alinsky's text is still so relevant to you today. Understanding these rules fundamentally changes how you view the world around you.
When you watch a modern protest, or a corporate boardroom battle, or a fierce political campaign, you really start to see the matrix.
You look past the lofty moral rhetoric everyone is broadcasting to justify their actions.
You begin to see the underlying mechanics, like you recognize when a group is deliberately going outside their enemy's experience to cause panic.
You see how they use ridicule to strip dignity, or how they leverage the mere threat of a disruption to force a backroom negotiation.
You realize the world isn't moved by angels acting purely on good intentions. It is moved by organized people applying strategic pressure to achieve specific ends.
It forces you to ask, who has the power here? And what tactics are they using to either maintain it or take it away?
It really is like finding the true map of the city. The roads might be full of potholes and sharp turns, but at least you finally know where you are standing.
There is a final, rather unsettling thought to consider, though.
Oh, what's that?
Alinsky's entire philosophy relies on using the establishment's own rules against them. The proxy tactic works because corporate law allows it. The airport bathroom tactic works because public facilities exist.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. What happens to grassroots movements when the establishment simply rewrites the rules?
Exactly. If a movement gains traction using proxies, what stops the massive institutions from changing shareholder laws to make gathering those proxies impossible?
Or changing the laws around public assembly to neutralize a disruptive threat?
Right. Who really wins when the world as it is simply changes its shape to protect itself.
If the map itself is constantly being redrawn by the people who own the roads, how do the have-nots ever find their way out?
That's the real question.
That is certainly something for you to mull over. We'll leave it there. Until next time.